Welcome to Beyond the Lecture, a show that takes listeners beyond the Lifelong Learning Program's lecture series alongside the LLP's program coordinator, Elizabeth Appell Sheets, and I, broadcast journalism and media production double major Nolan Duncan, as we speak with the lecture speakers as they go into more depth about the topics they discussed. For today's show, we have Dr. Mersman, if you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself fully.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Mersman, and I'm an assistant professor at Marshall University in the history department. My specialty, though, is the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. I love learning about women, African Americans' role in the Civil War, the built environment and memory of the Civil War, and I'm really happy to be here today.
So I know you talked a little bit about it during the lecture, but could you go over why you focused on Gothic Victorian for the lecture, since your focus is Reformation and the Civil War? Yeah.
So it's a little bit different than my actual research, right? My research is on the Reconstruction era and how the South physically rebuilds in the post-war era, so the literal reconstruction of Reconstruction, but this understanding of Victorian mourning comes more from a hobby, if anything. It comes from a fascination with the 19th century, which is the Victorian era, even over in the United States, right? Queen Victoria, her reign and influence extends across the Atlantic Ocean. And it also stems from the fact that I am interested in the Civil War and Reconstruction, and so much of the Victorian era is tied up in, how people mourned 750,000 deaths from the Civil War. How do you grieve for somebody when you no longer have a body to grieve over, right? When you can't say your last rites in front of them, when they can't, see their families, when there's distance between that. And this is more just a fascination for, it's something to break up the semester for my students. And typically around Halloween time, I like to do this. My mentor, Carrie Janey, who's at UVA, she actually started this tradition. So I see myself as continuing it on and getting the students engaged in something other than the traditional survey of the U.S. history.
So I was present, of course, for the presentation, and we loved it. Our group loved this presentation, and there was so much to take from it. And we don't want you to, I'm not going to ask you to give the presentation again, but I have some questions. One of my questions that came out that I want to ask is, how did spiritualism open doors for women during that time?
Oh, that's a really great question. So when talking about women's roles, and particularly women's roles in death and mourning, they play a really big part. And it's not just, during the Civil War, it's before the war. Women are the ones typically to clothe the body in a shroud, prepare everything, whether it's the parlor area where they're being laid out. So a lot of death has been women's roles. And the spiritualism movement really hits its stride in the 1880s, 1890s. And it was, in fact, a religious movement, right? And it basically allowed for contact with spirits who knew a lot. They were intelligent. They had, very progressive ideas, good moral compass. And women seemed to be that bridge, right? This was a very unique space for women to enter because they're the ones doing a lot of the rituals of death and mourning. And so they are already seen as caring, as nurturing. So this is almost a natural, seeing them as a bridge to the spirit world is kind of a natural way to enter into it. Also, interestingly enough, a lot of these women who are in this spiritualism movement, which contacts the spirits through, often seances, and they'll hear like rapping noises, right? these women are typically part of larger, what we call like benevolent movements. They've maybe been involved with abolitionism, temperance before the war, maybe soldiers' aid societies during the American Civil War. So a lot of like, reform movement, service work. And so they move into this space. Many already have very many ideas that are like pushing the bounds of, gender, of space, and they're claiming this seance world for themselves. And it's really unique in the fact that most of them are women, and for the first time, or one of the first times, they're speaking to mixed groups of both men and women. Before this, that was not allowed to do that. So they had a really big role in the spiritualism movement, and it gave them quite a bit more power than they had before. Especially because spirits could comment on politics. Spirits could comment on women's rights movements. Spirits could comment on. So
And one of the things that I there's a lot I got from this lecture, but it was almost mourning was to me almost more of a women's role than men, because women had certain clothing they had to wear or couldn't wear. There were rules about jewelry. There were rules about, how long they had to wear black clothing. And then there was a point they could wear, not so dark, but still dark. But another facet that I found interesting was this mourning process during this time. Was it a profitable venture? Or were people, or was it a popular venture, or was it just for entertainment?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. So there's a few dynamics at play at this moment, and one of them is that the 19th century created a lot of extra commodities in a way around death, right? Much like you've said, women can move through the stages of mourning through their clothes. So you got to be wealthy in order to, be buying
wardrobe.
Yes. So be buying this wardrobe of full mourning, and then after a year, maybe you're in half mourning. So you've got a different wardrobe of purples and some decorative pearls, perhaps. But there's also, commodification in like hair jewelry, right? Taking a piece of hair and making it into a ring from your dead loved one, or capturing their likeness in a daguerreotype. Daguerreotype photography is coming out at this time, right? So on one hand, it allows the living for the first time to kind of bridge that gap to the world of the dead. But on the other hand, it very much does commodify everything. And so it's kind of how much are you willing to spend to, remember your loved one? How much money can you put into remembering them? And what does that mean? Which
leads me to another facet, post-mortem photography. It was very expensive, correct? And so was it fraud or hope? Because you talked about Mary Todd Lincoln, a picture of her, and behind her was a shadow of the president. Is that fraud or hope?
Yes, and that's what they were even asking at the time.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Because it is this this death photography, this post-mortem photography. So on one hand, there is, just it's images of the dead and perhaps their loved ones, and maybe something that shows their identity, like their beloved book or a beloved dog or something like that. But on the other hand, you also have these images that are being played with. It's kind of like what is it? The modern day. Photoshop, yes. Yeah, it's like Photoshop of it.
Photoshop, yes.
Right? And so they've got a picture of Mary Todd Lincoln, and then you've kind of have this image of what looks to be Abraham Lincoln dubbed over her, putting his hands on her shoulders, And it's not just, she wasn't the only one, even though Mary Todd Lincoln, well known for even, having seances in the White House, right? But it's others, because after the Civil War, people want to feel close to their dead loved one that maybe they didn't get a chance to say goodbye to, or just know that they're watching over them. And so in many ways, especially for like Mary Todd Lincoln, it is hope. And especially that picture of Mary Todd Lincoln is also helpful for the nation, especially in the Union side. After Abraham Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865, the nation is also mourning the president's death, right, at his peak when the war is coming to an end. And so it's supposed to help heal a nation as well.
But there's comfort.
There's comfort.
There's an element of comfort.
There's comfort.
Yes.
But like you said, there's also fraud.
Yes. Because people were taken advantage of.
Yes.
And I imagine that these photographs didn't come cheaply. That they were probably a little expensive, and you had to be in the upper echelon to afford it.
Yeah.
And I think people in a mourning situation are more vulnerable to being taken advantage of.
That's a great point. Yes, they are more vulnerable. They're looking for hope somewhere any way they can get it.
Why do you think they commodified that hope back then?
So that's a good question. And the very crass answer is, it goes back to capitalism. Somebody sees a market and they're taking, taking advantage, taking profit. And it's not only in this realm, especially after the Civil War. We also see people taking profit of like Civil War veterans. Many are addicted to opioids after the war, both Confederate and Union veterans. And there is a market for opium cures to be sold in newspapers. And interestingly enough, a lot of these quote-unquote cures, which are not regulated by any stretch of the imagination, right, by the Food and Drug Act, because it's not around, a lot of these cures that the veterans are saying like, oh, it worked, my symptoms went away. And it's because some of them contained a small amount of opium. So that would reduce the withdrawal that they would go through. And so there is big markets, especially after the Civil War, to whether give hope or, assuage, opium disorder or something along those lines. And I will note that's a shout out to Jonathan Jones at JMU University. He's got a book on opium slavery that just came out, and he discusses all of that.
And another thing that I thought was interesting, I didn't know this, that basically from the Civil War, we learned how to embalm. And as I understand, it began with typically more wealthy soldiers from the Union Army. And it was a way to make your loved one look like they were just asleep, kind of a comfort thing.
Yeah.
But it became necessary because of all the deaths during the Civil War. And you talked about when President Lincoln was assassinated that he was taken across the country, as I understand, for a period of time.
Yes,
like about 6 months or something like that.
Oh, off the top of my head, I do not know, but it was a long
It was a long time. Can you touch on that?
So embalming really gets going during the Civil War, and particularly in the Union area, on the Union side, and it's a little bit crude at the beginning, right? They started thinking, let's freeze perhaps dead bodies, ice, but that clearly did not work, and so they moved to embalming and chemicals, and they found out that this did preserve these men, and it was very expensive. Like any new technology today, it is very expensive outright. Only some of the wealthiest could really pay to have this done for their sons, brothers, and fathers. But it was a way to make them appear, how we embalm today. They just appear simply sleeping, right? And it was also a way in which, these soldiers who had so many wounds and bullets ripped through them that it was a way for them to appear like, the war hasn't caused that much destruction. This is still their son. This is still their father. And it also gives families sometimes enough time, because, it prolongs the process of, seeing the human being and putting the decay off. And so this allows the body to return to families in enough time for them to see their son, father, brother, and to say goodbye and to be with them at that moment, which so many families during the war did not get.
Right. Getting back to, was it fraud or hope, profitable? Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little more about the Fox sisters?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Fox sisters. So they started kind of all of this, and there is a very specific date, and I'm not going to even try it because it escapes me, but there is a very specific date that the movement started, the spiritualism movement, and it starts with the Fox sisters. Up in New York, and essentially there's a dead peddler that they contact him, and this is the first time where there's audible rapping noises, mm-hmm. right? And this really takes things in a different direction. Before somebody could be like, oh yes, a ghost or somebody, a deceased loved ones came to me in a premonition, or I saw them, right? But this is the first time where there was like audible noises. There was something tangible that people could hold on to, and the Fox sisters said that they talked to this deceased peddler that way, and then their lives took off, right? They were quite profitable on their ventures after that, and many would follow in their footsteps, especially many women.
Is that kind of when Mary Todd Lincoln kind of caught up in this seance?
Yes. So I believe the start of the spiritualism movement, about 1840s is when it starts. Mary Todd Lincoln will definitely, during the war, which is 1861 to 65, she'll start having seances in the White House because, she lost multiple sons, especially little Willie in the White House. And so she's trying to connect herself to the loved ones. But yeah, it goes from like 1840s to I believe the 1920s, but the peak for spiritualism is like in the 1880s, early 1890s.
You talked about links to reform, mm-hmm. that spirits could provide useful knowledge and moral guidance.
They absolutely could. Whether it's on your taxes, right? Whether it's about politics, but what we do see is there's a large overlap of those who are getting into the spiritualism movement. Those who are running the seances are also connected to a lot of other political movements, whether it be temperance or women's rights or previously abolitionism or prison reform movements. And so it's kind of a natural trajectory that, if they want a little bit of confirmation about, where their political views are and policies they like, they're going to contact the spirits, and the spirits will readily agree with them.
So one of the key things that I have taken from this wonderful presentation that you provided was that mourning was a role especially suited for women, mm-hmm. and it would be important in post-Civil War. Do you want to touch on that just a...
Right, yeah. So women's roles, especially in mourning, really, whether it's the spiritualism movement or otherwise, they take off, or maybe not take off, they continue. Women have always been involved in the church, in the community, and big roles in death and mourning. But especially in the post-war era, what we see with especially Confederate women, or former Confederate women, I should say, there are a lot of them who take up the work of reinterring Confederate men's bodies back into the South, putting wreaths on their graves. And this work of remembering, of reinterring, of honoring the dead falls a lot to women in the post-war, because they are seen as apolitical. Right? They are seen as apolitical. Men are seen as political. So if Confederate veterans, if they are doing this work, they're seen as making a political statement. So it is safer if women do the work of honoring these Confederates and reinter them and put memorials on their graves. And this is where we see a lot of the start of the Lost Cause memory strand come out of women's work in the post-war era and a little bit during the war, trying to honor these men and keeping their memory alive and, what they fought for. Because especially after the Civil War, when the Confederates lost, they have to create some sort of narrative of like, okay, we just sent many, many men to their death. What did this all mean? What did this death and destruction mean? And so they have to start crafting a narrative to give symbolism, to give meaning to these, hundreds of thousands of men, brothers, sons, fathers who died. And this is a lot of, I know this well because this is my mentor, Carrie Janey's work, her first book, but she talks about that if anybody's interested in reading her book.
Yes. I really feel like that something I took a lot. There was so much to take from this lecture that we so much enjoyed it, a presentation.
I crammed so much in, I know.
Oh, it was wonderful. And so one thing I take is that from the beginning of time, there were always roles for women. And as time, marched on, women took on more and more roles that got them out of the house, gave them meaningful work that was acceptable work. And I see that during this time that this was all about, I think this was all about women. I really do. I think the spiritualism movement was geared toward women. And I think that women, I think there was some fraud they were taken advantage of, but mostly it helped them and others accept death, deal with death, honor loved ones. And there was a lot to this, more than we realize.
Yes.
This movement.
Women have had a very big role throughout history, and especially in the 19th century. They moved into spaces that was not, traditional for them. And a lot of times they're actually couching that in, but of course we can do more with these benevolent movements. And yes, we should have ideas and, our opinions on temperance and on spiritualism and on women's rights because we are, and they're using, a 19th century argument, we are inherently nurturing. Guys, we are inherently caring, right? We are the ones that, should be doing a lot of these moral reform movements like this. And so that's how they often get, the roles in death and mourning, the roles in spiritualism, because they're seen as, those natural caregivers to men, but it also ironically pushes them into far new spaces. And I mean, especially during the Civil War, there's a shortage of men. So you've got women who are actually in government roles, even, in the Treasury Department, cutting notes too, which while many do lose their jobs afterward to men, quite a few of them still stay on in the government job. They're called government girls. And so women do create new rules. I mean, nursing was an entirely male profession prior to the Civil War, but understanding they needed to tap this resource during the Civil War of women to become nurses, this really opens up in the post-war nursing as a women's profession. And so the Civil War often creates much more opportunity for women to move into spaces, whether some that are a little more familiar, but others that are not.
Which goes back to our thesis, or my thesis, is that your thesis, that spiritualism opened doors for women. Who would have thought that at the time?
Really, it's an interesting concept, and because of the way in which spiritualism is a little bit, we're like, we're playing and talking to spirits, but it gives these women power, right? It gives these women power. They're talking to spirits, they're listening to spirits, and so through that, they are granted power by the spirits to dictate things on the ground, which is, it's quite powerful.
I'm kind of jumping around, but another thought that you told us about funeral parlors and first became open by African Americans.
So yes, there are white funeral parlors and African American funeral parlors, but I should have mentioned, especially with embalming, many African Americans were assistants in this embalming process, and a lot of it is because, they were the ones on plantations, enslaved persons were the ones on plantations to do a lot of the embalming of, whether plantation owners or the families of the plantation owners. And they took on that role very early on. And so this was seen as, as a way in which they could, I guess, further that skill and help out and assist. And because of that,
a major contribution.
Yeah, because of that, that's one of the first roles, or I should first official jobs for African Americans in the post-war era. After emancipation, right? They knew those skills, and so they could go into this new idea of the funeral home and a funeral director for African Americans, and giving them that home and space. And it quite grew through the Gilded Age as one of the major professions for many African Americans. Still segregated, right? Yeah. But
my really only other question is, I know you had a spot in your presentation about further readings. Is there any specific books you would recommend to people that want to look into this further, and which one specifically and why?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I love that you asked that question. So probably the biggest one, especially that I worked with on this lecture, is going to be Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering. And she looks at death and mourning during the Civil War. We've got this idea of a good death. This is somebody is dying surrounded by their family, their body is whole, and then the Civil War comes and completely screws that up. And so what changes during wartime because of the American Civil War, or what changes for death and mourning culture? And so a lot of this is based on her work, This Republic of Suffering. It's got some accolades. I have all of my students read it, so it's one of my top favorite books of the American Civil War. Other things to look at and to read, if you're interested in more about the Lost Cause Memory Strand and how that begins, particularly with women and these cemeteries and memorial rituals, I would check out Caroline Janey's Burying the Dead But Not the Past. She goes into that starting during the war, on what these ladies' memorial associations, these Confederate women, are doing for their men. And I would just say, if you're interested in what I mentioned about opium and opioids use and abuse during and after the Civil War, check out Jonathan Jones's newest book, hot off the presses, I think, in the last week that we're recording this podcast, is going to be Opium Slavery.
That's all the questions I've got.
I think, I could listen to the whole lecture over again. It was absolutely fascinating. We learned so much, and I honestly didn't know much about the spiritualism movement. I want to call it, and the ghoulish aspects of the Victorian culture. I mean, what a great topic! Yeah. And so, thank you so much for taking time this morning to speak with us. And
it was a great time. We've enjoyed having you, and we hope to feature you again one day.
Thank you both so much. Appreciate it.
We'd like to thank our guest once again for joining us to share a deeper understanding of their lecture topic. If you're as hungry for knowledge as we are and want to hear other interviews or even previous lectures from the LLP, check out the LLP on YouTube at Marshall University Lifelong Learning Program. And if you want to learn more about the Lifelong Learning Program and how to join, check out their website at marshall.edu/LLP. I'm Nolan Duncan, and you've been listening to Beyond the Lecture. Have a great day.